What's good, everybody? Welcome back to the Life of a Champ podcast. For today's episode 180, we're going to be discussing who's telling your story. Now, unfortunately, we had to restart this one for whatever reason, but we're going to go ahead and get it rocking. A few things I want to say before I go to get it started. Make sure you go and follow me on Twitch, TikTok, and on Rumble at Life of a Champ podcast on every platform. Tap in with that for sure. If you're new, make sure you go to let me know that you're new. Leave a like on today's video. If you have any questions or comments regarding today's episode, make sure you go ahead and leave it in the comments or also leave it in the live chat as well, because I'll be being able to see the live chat as well. Also, if you're on Twitch, let me know. I'll be willing to see that as well. I'll be checking the Twitch chat as well. All right, sounds good. Very, very good. Unfortunate. Okay, we're going to go into rocking. So today's episode, like I had mentioned, who's telling your story? Now, this is a very, very important question that I would say most people would answer or would like to answer the same way. So me asking you the question, who's telling your story, right? Most people are going to say, oh, I'm telling my story. But then you begin to evaluate people's lives, the decisions they make, and why they make the decisions that they make, right? You begin to be seeing it from the observer's eye, as opposed to hearing somebody say it from their own mouth, right? And you begin to realize very, very quickly that most people are not telling their story. Their story is somewhat being told, but they're not the one that's telling it. Their life is being lived, but they're barely the one that's living it. And I find that to be very, very interesting. So like I said, when I ask you the question, be honest with yourself. Who's telling your story? What is the realistic guiding force that dictates your story? Is it actually you, or is it the circumstances that you're in? Is it actually you, or is it the excuses that you tell yourself that guide you truly? Is it you yourself, or is it the emotions that you have that dictate whether you get work done or whether you don't get work done? Whether you improve yourself or whether you don't improve yourself? Is it the, oh, I'll do it later, or, oh, I'll do it tomorrow? Is it that mindset? Are you leading with that? Is that telling your story? Begin to ask yourself all these questions, because these questions are very, very important and must be answered. And like I said, you must be real with yourself. Because like I said, most people would like to give themselves the illusion of, you know what, I'm in charge. I'm in control. And like I said, realistically, for the most part, that's not true. And it's never been true. So, who's telling your story? For me personally, I'd say this for the longest time. For the longest time, even when I was already deep into my self-development journey, who was telling my story? I would say my environment. My curated environment was telling my story. And when I say curated environment, it was the friends that I selected, the actions that I was the actions that my environment suggested that were good to do. That dictated a lot of what's telling my story. Also, like I said, my curated environment online as well. Everybody has their own curated environment. If you don't know what that is, essentially it's all the things that you select to go ahead and choose to consume, right? All the things that you want to go ahead and watch. That is essentially going to be most people's guiding force of who's telling your story, right? So with that being said, there's a great argument to be made that most people are not telling their story. So you must ask yourself, why is that? What are the limiting factors and the difference between somebody who is telling their story and somebody who's truly not, who's letting outside things dictate who's actually telling that story, right? So obviously, if you've seen the theme in these last, let's just say, like 10 episodes, right? It's been a very, very similar theme, but I'm gonna go ahead and do another twist for this one specifically. But I think it's very interesting, and I need people to truly open their eyes to see how much control is being had over your life and the decisions that you make, and even the free will that you think you have. You might not have it as much as you would like to think, and that is the harshest reality that I came to as of recently when it comes to people and how they operate within their own life. I think that's very, very interesting. So like I said, let's be honest. Is it your environment or is it you that's dictating who tells your story, right? And the only way that you really can reclaim control over who tells your story is if you decide to make decisions for yourself that, regardless of how you feel, that you know is best for you in your life and the future you it should exist, right? You must make decisions based off of that, because if you choose not to, we all know who's telling your story. You see what I'm saying? The only way that you're actually telling your story is if you're conscious, if you're a conscious storyteller. If you're constantly applying new things, evaluating things to see if they work, taking out the things that don't and implementing more things that do. That is you telling your story. So like when I was saying earlier, who's telling your story? Is it your environment? Is it the circumstances that you're in? Is it the excuses that you tell yourself? Of course, those all somewhat play a role within what is actually telling your story, right? But with that being said, that's why I mentioned, I see time and time again, most people are not telling their story. So who's telling your story? Answer those questions for yourself. And like I mentioned, for me, for the longest time, it wasn't exactly me. It was me to an extent, but it wasn't being told from my future self. Does that make sense? You want your future self to tell a story about your current situation that is favorable to your future self and your future self. Think about that for a second. Think about that for a second. And if you choose to defy that, who's telling your story then? To an extent, when I'm saying this, you yourself right now shouldn't be telling your story. Think about that for a second. You yourself right now, and it kind of goes into this scenario. I'm sure you've heard this before. What you want and what you want to want. That's all. I'll break that down for you, for the people that don't understand this paradigm before. There are certain things that you want, right? So I want to eat unhealthy. Most people want to eat unhealthy, right? But what you want to want is to eat better, because you know your future self will thank you. And you also know if you just eat what you want right now, your future self is going to be kicking you in the ass, saying my past self made a mistake, right? So it's almost that same thing. So who's telling your story? Is it what you want right now? Is it this present moment that is telling you this story? Or is it your future self that is telling the story? Ask that question for yourself. For me personally, I would like to think, and of course everybody would say they would like to think this as well, right? But like I said, you must evaluate the actions of that person. I would like to think my future self is telling the story of the present moment right now. And it is because, based off of my actions, based off of my habits, based off of the things that I choose to do that are great long-term investments, that maybe I don't see as much benefit in the current moment, but a year goes by, 2 years goes by, and now I see the rewards that will be reaped from the trees that I planted 2 or 3 years ago, right? Or maybe even 6 years ago when I started my self-development journey, right? But that should be the one that tells the story, not what you want right now, not who you are right now. That person should not be telling the story, because like I had mentioned, if this person was telling the story, if the present moment person was telling the story, would they even be telling a good story at all? And that's most important. So begin to evaluate that for yourself. If you yourself right now is telling the story of your life right now and of your future, is that a story that you even want to hear? Is that even a story worth hearing? Think about that think about that. Think about that. What you want truly, not want to want, not all that, not all that. What you want, what most people want, is for them to be in a position where their future self, which is like I said, which would be your present self, right, is essentially reflecting back storytelling, right, about the present self right now, right? I know you hopefully you don't get too lost, right? But they're talking about them in a favorable way, right? So the only way that your future self could talk about your present self in a favorable way is if you're taking the actions today that would reap you the benefits of the future. You're doing it and you're investing in your future self. You're not investing in your present self because, like I mentioned, right? If I wanted to invest in my present self, most people, just like I would probably not invest too wisely. Let's just say that. And that is the case for most people. Most people are investing for themselves right now. They make decisions for how they feel right now. They make decisions that don't dictate a great future. And then they're mad why they're in a future position. I thought things were going to change. I hoped for things to go ahead and change. I prayed for things to go ahead and change. But your present self didn't change. So why the hell would your future self change? It wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't make any sense. But yet you see so many people whose lives are not getting told by themselves. Think about that. Like I had mentioned, who's telling your story? Is it actually you, or is it the excuses that you tell yourself? Is it that limiting voice within your head that is telling the story? Is it your environment that is putting you down, that is telling your story? And are you just accepting of that? Because if you're not accepting of that, if you are not satisfied with your current situation right now, you're the only person that can change that. So therefore, what are the actions that would suggest a change that you'd want? And then when you begin to ask yourself that question, you must understand that most people still, even with me saying that, still not going to do anything with that. That's the craziest part about it. And like I had mentioned, and then they wonder why the hell the story of their life isn't a great story to tell that no one wants to hear. It is because you didn't even want to hear that story, because your present self is making the decisions. Like I had mentioned, who's telling your story? And like I said, your present self, when I'm mentioning your present self telling the story, your present self is going to be comprised of all the things that you choose to go ahead and do. Like I said, maybe it's your environment that influences you to do certain things, right? Take certain actions, build certain habits, create certain friends, go out certain places, right? Have new experiences, for the better or for the worse, right? These things are essentially going to dictate your your present moment, right? But with all this being said, who's telling your story? Is it you? Is it you of the future that's telling a great story? Or is it you of the future that is telling the same story that they're living in right now? You see what I'm saying? Like I said, hopefully you can keep up with what I'm trying to say, but there's just too much of a strong argument to be had when it comes to the perception that you could have of most people and their life and the story that they've told. That has been told, essentially, which is their existence, right? Most of them, they don't have a good story to tell, so no one hears it. No one cares to listen. That's just what it is. That's just being real with it, right? So, like I had mentioned, what are the limiting factors that are limiting you from telling a great story in the future? Those things are the poor decisions that most people make on a day to day basis. They cannot see anything past the current moment. It's almost as if they don't think the future will happen. And then 5 years goes by and they say, where did the time go? What was I doing within that time? Why am I not where I want to be? Why am I not who I want to be? And it's because of your poor decision making. It's always going to end like that. It's always going to end with your present moment. What are the decisions that you're making in the present moment? Are they good enough for your future self? Are they good enough to be told later in a story that hopefully is a great one? Or are they not? That's just what it is, man. Begin to ask yourself these questions because these questions will dictate your life, whether you would like to admit it or not, whether you want to hear that or not, whether you believe in me or whether you don't believe in me or not. It's that, like I said, I didn't make it this way. This is I'm nothing more than an observer just like you when it comes to these things. But like I had mentioned, right? Evaluate the people around you. Who's telling their story truly? Who's telling their story? For the most part, it's not them. It's not who they want to be telling the story. Think about that. Think about that. Appreciate everyone stopping by. Like I said, if you're on Twitch, man, let me know. We're going in on this one, man. But I'm gonna get into the second part here in a minute. But like I said, if you've taken anything from this so far, let me know. Let me know for sure. But yes, I just think this is a very, very interesting topic because me myself is a person that is being very, very conscious and, like I said, observably more conscious than people around me when it comes to how they choose to live their life and what are they living their life for. Like I had mentioned, I am unfortunately surrounded by a lot of people, even people that I love, that are so locked in to the present moment. It's almost as if they don't think the future will exist. The decisions that they're making aren't sound decisions, aren't wise decisions based off of hopefully what you were supposed to learn in the previous years of your life. You would think that if you had learned certain things, that you would actively try to apply them, which would be wisdom, right? You acquire knowledge in the present moment, you go through an experience, and the experiences allow you to go ahead and apply the knowledge, which would turn into wisdom if applied correctly, right? But it's almost as if you didn't learn anything at all. It's what did you do with your time? Like I said, who's telling the story? Who was telling the story in the first place? Was it you, or was it everything else that is dictating your actions? Which, for the better or for the worse, is probably going to end up in a less than desirable situation with your future self. Like I said, essentially what I'm trying to do is this, right? The last thing I want for you, and this is the last thing you should want for yourself as well, is for you to be thinking about, you to be in the future moment, which is now the present moment, right? Saying, "Damn, I really should have made some better decisions. I should have listened to him. I should have listened to myself, more importantly. I should have listened to that voice inside that was guiding me, but I ignored it because I wanted to stay comfortable, because I wanted to stay safe, because I didn't want to know what else was out there, because I didn't want to put myself in that uncomfortable position to see what could have happened." That is what I don't want for you, and that is what you shouldn't want for yourself. And that is what most people don't want for themselves, whether they would like to admit it or not, right? Who's telling your story, man? Because think about it. I would like to think my future self is telling the story of my life right now, right? And the question is, how are they telling the story? Who's telling the story, and how are they telling it? That's very, very important. Because if they're not telling it with enthusiasm, if they're not telling it they're not telling it with praise, somewhat praise, right? You know, being thankful, right? If they're not telling with the thankful, with being grateful and thankful, right? Then maybe they're not telling a good story, and that might be what it is. But like I mentioned, right? If you want that for yourself as well, if you ask yourself the question, who's telling your story, and then you answer that question saying, I would like my future self to be telling the story, okay? What would make that future self proud? What decisions today could make that future version of yourself that will probably exist, God willing, will exist? What would make them proud? Because if it's not a great decision, then like I'd mentioned, you're going to be looking back and saying, "Holy shit, where did the time go?" Regret is one of the worst feelings to feel. Feeling a loss of time is also one of the worst feelings to feel. The only way to avoid that is to be making sure that your future self is telling the story of your present self in a way that is enthusiastic. Because if not, it was for nothing. It was honestly for nothing. I want to get into the second part of the podcast because I think this part is one of the most interesting parts that I've ever talked about in a podcast, right? And it is going to go hand in hand with what I mentioned earlier with who is telling the story, right? And this is more importantly something I need you to go ahead and reflect yourself because I was, just eating one day and I had came up with this idea because I found this idea to be very profound. And it is what I would deem to be all telling, right? And so it's in some type of capacity, right? It was reflecting on people who are great storytellers and what a great story consists of and things like that, right? And I came to the conclusion that a great story is more about who told it and how they told it as opposed to what actually happened. Think about that for a second. When you're hearing a great story, hearing a great story, right? Everybody loves a great story. Everybody loves to sit down and hear a great story being told, right? It's if you think about it, regardless of what they say, it's usually more about who told it and how they told it, right? We've seen it all time and time again. I'm sure you've heard the same story from two different people, and it sounds like it had two different outcomes, it had two different reactions, right? Because, like I mentioned, it is not necessarily so much about what the story. It's not so much about what actually happened within the story, as opposed to, like I mentioned, who told it and how did they tell it. So, like I said, this is one of the things that I found very very interesting. Something that you can go ahead and reflect for yourself, right? So like I said, taking that and applying that to what was said earlier. Who's telling the story? In my opinion, a great story would be told for my future self. And how they told that is also very, very important. And hopefully, they tell it, future champ, tells it in an enthusiastic way that is able to capture the attention of people around him, just as you would want that for yourself, hopefully. Or maybe here's the thing, maybe it doesn't matter for you. Maybe it doesn't matter for you. Maybe the person who tells the story is going to be your present self. And like I said, maybe you don't care what happens. You just want somebody to listen. But like I had mentioned, people are only going to stay and really listen is if that person is somebody they want to hear. That's it. So right now, are you building somebody that someone in the future is going to want to hear? Or are you not? Most people aren't. That's just what it is. Most people aren't. So that's why I say most people's lives and the story that they tell fall onto deaf ears. And that's just the reality of it, right? And that's no fun in my opinion. Because like I said, I like to hear a great story, and I also like to tell a great story. And I'm sure you like to hear a great story. I couldn't imagine a world in which you didn't. Why would you do anything? Literally anything. You wouldn't watch any movies, you wouldn't watch any shows, you wouldn't really care for a lot of things in life if you didn't like to hear a great story. And like I said, who do you want to be telling that story as well? When we talk about the story of your life, right? When I talk about the story of my life, right? Who's telling that story? And how are they telling the story? Like I mentioned earlier, kinda. The story of your life should be a great story that everyone wants to hear you tell. You must live it out and then be able to tell it in an interesting way that people will stay and listen. Because if not, like I mentioned, it's almost as if your story was for nothing. That's just what it is. And like I mentioned earlier, most people's lives, unfortunately, are very boring stories because they don't do anything that's worth even saying later on. So, are you doing things that are worth saying later on, or are you not? And why is that? Like I said, why would that even be a possibility for you? Evaluate. Why would that even be a possibility for you in your life? Because of the decisions you make. It all goes down back to the daily decisions that you make. It's all going to go down to whether you said, I wanted to stay comfortable or I wanted to do something that was, a little bit outside of my comfort. That is the difference. That is purely the difference between somebody who tells a great story and somebody who tells a story, but nobody wants to hear it. That is the clear difference. That is the only difference, in my opinion. And I want to throw in a different element to this as well because I find this to be very very interesting. This goes hand in hand with what I'm making right now. I'm in the process of making my first course, right? And in the process of making my first course, it is a dating and attraction course. If I haven't talked about it on podcast, this will be the first time I mention it, maybe. So right now, let me give you a little bit of backstory before I get into it, right? So I spent the last 6 years being absolutely fascinated about dating, about attraction, about all these things because I recognized from an early age that I kind of wanted to have a very, very solid relationship, right? I didn't exactly get to see fully an example of that the way that I would have liked growing up. Now I did see one, of course, but it's obviously kind of you want to see your mom and your dad, of course, but things don't work out always, right? So I wanted to say, you know what, I would like my story to be told a certain way. But in order for my story to be told a certain way, I must break it down. What is going to make something last, right? So I started researching. This is another thing I researched. What are most problems that most relationships have, and why do they fail? That is something that, like I said, always fascinated me. So therefore, I went ahead and did a lot of research on that. And of course, just like all men, you want to be able to be confident around women. So that is another thing that I went ahead and researched. Right, like I said, with dating and attraction. But I want to kind of give you this different element that I found to be very, very interesting and was actually one of my advantages when it comes to dating and attraction. And this is going to go hand in hand with any man who's good with women. What story are you telling women? That's a huge one. That is a huge one. That is the difference between somebody who's able to attract women and somebody who's not. Now, like I said, I find that to be very, very interesting. Just observing that. Me and another man could have the same exact life, and you would think, tell the same exact story. And maybe this story wouldn't be that interesting. Maybe there'd be way more interesting stories that could be told from a different person, right? But the difference between me, for the example, right? For the example speaking, me and the average and the other person, like I said, same life, same existence, same stories that could be told. What is the difference between a woman choosing me and a woman choosing that person? It's simply, or choosing another person in general, right? Is simply how I'm telling the story of my life. That's it. Who I am, who I present myself to be, the story that is told, and how it's being told. That is the only difference. The thing is, most men, they don't have an interesting story to tell. They have a very boring story to tell. So therefore, when they get introduced to a woman, the woman's not really that interested because the story that the man's telling is really not that interesting of a story. And then the man's wondering, why is this woman not attracted to me? You're not telling a great story, and nobody wants to hear a boring story. Nobody does. That person probably doesn't have that many friends either. Let's just be for real with it, because their story is not that interesting, right? And that is simply the deciding factor of whether a person or a woman will stay with you or whether a woman doesn't. That is also one of the main reasons a man will stay with you versus a man that doesn't. I have dated enough women to understand that there are plenty, unfortunately, too many boring women that do exist. And they also have told me that there's plenty of men that are very boring, that tell very, very boring stories. They were able to tell me that as well. And that one element is the difference between you keeping somebody or you even being or that person even worth staying, like I said, at all in any capacity, right? It is simply how you tell the story, and it is simply the character that is telling the story. That is for the most part, that is it. And the last thing that you want to do, like I said, most men tell boring stories, so therefore they're not very good with women, right? They're not good with attraction, they're not good with dating. The last thing that you ever want to do with women is to bore them. That's the last thing that any woman wants. That's the last thing that anybody wants, but more importantly, when it comes to attraction's sake, the last thing you ever want to do is bore a woman. Because she will leave you because she's not entertained by the story that you told. And that's it, man. And then one thing I want to mention as well is like I said, most people are really not good at telling stories, and for the obvious reasons that I mentioned earlier, right? Another man can be living a better life than you, but maybe he's really not that good at telling stories. So even when he gets the opportunity with women, maybe he doesn't thrive. And maybe you have a little bit more of a boring life, but maybe you're making decisions for your life that are maybe a little bit out there, maybe a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit more different. Maybe you're exploring your curiosities. Maybe you're asking more questions than the average person, even though your current situation would suggest maybe it's not that interesting of a story. But yet the woman could definitely choose you over that other man because that other man doesn't know how to tell the story that he's living. That could be another possibility. Of course, a lot of men would like to say, you know what? I mean, oh, she just didn't choose me for one of these reasons, and maybe the reason is good, maybe it's not, maybe it's valid, maybe it's not, right? But what I will say is, how are you telling the story of your life? Are you even entertained by the story of your life, or are you not? And if you're not, if your future self is telling the story, think about this, right? Who's telling the story? Your future self is telling the story, and maybe he's telling a boring story. Maybe like I said, the way he's telling it, he's not enthusiastic about it. He's not really thrilled to tell the story. He's just kind of just getting by. He's just like it's all right, man. It's all right. You think a woman's gonna want to stay with that? Hell no, man. Hell no, man. And like I said, your ability to portray this in its a story and how you portray the story is the difference between a woman staying with you and the woman choosing another man. Simply, that's it. And like I mentioned, right? Have an interesting life and tell a boring story, and people are still going to view you as boring. That's just what it is. There is people that do exist that are living on the outside an interesting life. Maybe they do certain things. But when you get to having the conversation with them, maybe they're just really not that much of a people person, and they really just don't have their social skills that developed. And then it's just like, ah, yeah, man. You know what? On the outside, it looks really cool, man. But then I just got to know you, and it's just like you kind of suck, man. That's just being real with it. That's just being real with it. And I am sure that happens plenty and plenty of times. Unfortunately, that's just what it is. So, like I had mentioned, who's telling the story? Is it you in your present moment that's maybe not choosing the best actions for you? Maybe listening to their doubts, maybe falling into their excuses, or is it your future self that is telling a great story about how you did certain things, how you made certain sacrifices, how you disciplined yourself, the struggles that you went through? Or like I said, the other alternative is nobody listening to your story at all. Maybe it's not even a good enough story to be heard. Choose. You must choose it for yourself because you're the only person that is going to be able to be dictating whether this story is worth hearing or not, whether this story is even being worth being told or not. So, with that being said, you must live an interesting life to tell an interesting story. So, if you yourself right now would recognize that your story is not that interesting of a story, start to do more with your life. Start to challenge yourself. Start to dive into some of the curiosities that you've had. And really, realistically, there's really no alternative outside of that. Really, that's worth even contemplating. You're really just gonna choose a boring life and really not have any stories to tell. Maybe if you're lucky, have kids. Maybe or not. Maybe not. Right? Maybe your love life will suffer because you weren't able to tell an interesting story. Maybe that's what it is, and then maybe you'll never have kids. And those definitely, obviously, if you don't have any kids, then your story is definitely not gonna get told. That's for damn sure. So the ultimate lesson that I want to tell for today's episode is everybody loves a good story, but they love a good storyteller even more. And that's what it comes down to. You are the storyteller within your story, hopefully. And hopefully, like I had mentioned, it is your future self talking. Is that person going to be capable of telling a good story that people are willing to sit down and listen and maybe even take something from? Or maybe they're not. Another thing I want you to take is the simplest and most boring stories could be profound just off the tongue that it rolls out of. We all know people that have maybe told you a story, maybe it wasn't even that interesting of a story. The entire concept, if you were to just draw it out or maybe just like write it out, maybe it's really not that interesting, but the way that they were able to tell it, the character that they were able to muster up in order to be able to tell the story is everything. And another way to tell a very, very good story is to be paying attention to the little details, because the little details are literally everything. They will make or break a story. They will spice up a story, and they will also dumb one down. Those little details are very, very important. And like I said, maybe those little details for you is choosing one habit over another. Maybe those little details are you thinking one way over another. Maybe those little details are you choosing discomfort rather than comfort, choosing education over entertainment. Think about these things for yourself. Like I'd mentioned, I've came to the conclusion that I would love to tell a great story. And I also want to be able to live an interesting life, so I have and can easily tell interesting stories. Because, like I had mentioned, what really is your alternative? Is there really even an alternative that's even worth living out? And like I said, with evaluating that way, for me, really, there's really not. So ask yourself these questions. Who's telling your story? Who's telling your story? How is it being told? How is it being told? Are the small details are they carefully being evaluated? Are you doing anything interesting with your life, or are you just living your day-to-day life in a very, very boring, mundane, unconscious way? Because like I had mentioned, that is going to be able to tell all. If you would like to listen, if you would like to have a story that people want to listen to, make sure the life that you can tell, make sure the story that you can tell is at least somewhat interesting, because if not, nobody's going to listen. And if you would want to be able to tell a story where people would want to listen, you have to do something. You have to do not just something, you have to do multiple things that is going to get a person to be willing to stay. Because like I had mentioned, what is the alternative? The alternative, nobody's hearing your story, you living a boring life, and nobody wants to live a boring life, in my opinion. I don't. I can only speak for myself, right? But like I mentioned earlier in this podcast, most people aren't telling their own story. Their environment's telling their story. Their limiting mindsets are telling the story. Their mindset of, oh, I'll do it later, or oh, I'll do it tomorrow is telling their story. Maybe their current circumstance that they can't really see past is telling their story. Maybe it's the excuses that they've been telling themselves that is telling the story. But who's telling your story? And like I mentioned, how is it being told? Those are the most important things that I've came to the conclusion of over these last, let's just say, week and a half. So with that being said, that was episode 180 of the Life of a Champ podcast. I'm going to go ahead and end it off here in a minute. I appreciate everyone stopping by. Like I said, if you have any questions, or maybe you even want to tell me your story, I'd be more than willing to listen in the comments, whether you're watching this and putting a comment down, or whether you are in the comments right now. But other than that, like I mentioned, make sure you go ahead and follow me on Twitch, TikTok, and on Rumble, all at Life of a Champ podcast on every platform. YouTube Shorts and YouTube clips here coming out soon. I have a stack of them just waiting to go ahead and be released, which I'll be releasing here soon. So if you've been missing the shorts, or for like I mentioned, for whatever reason, do not want to catch a full live podcast, the shorts are coming very, very soon. And other than that, I said everything I need to say for today's episode. Besides the motto, man. Y'all know the motto, man. Fellas out here, man, we don't just work around here, man. We outwork. So make sure you outworking these motherfuckers, because you know that I am, man. Like I said, is the story that you're telling yourself in the future one that is outworking others? That is the last question I have for you to go ahead and answer. Y'all have a good night. Next podcast is going to be on Thursday. Tapping with that for sure. Like I had mentioned, more live streams here soon. once I figure out these issues that I've been having with my studio. Let's just say that. Y'all have a good night, and like I